Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of the New England Biography series sponsored by the Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is Kenneth Horn, Wall Street Channel. I'm the Director of Research at the MHS. I'd also like to thank Cassie Cloutier, who's the Assistant Director of Research, who's helping us make sure that everything is working properly on Zoom. And I'd also like to thank Sam Hurwitz, who is our podcast producer and technical engineer who's helping us out with the cameras in the room here at 1154 Boylston Street. We also want to thank the steering committee members for the New England Biography series. They always bring us wonderful presenters who encourage all of us to think very critically about both the craft of history and biography. And they are Megan Marshall from Emerson College, Julie Dobrow from Tufts University, and Natalie Dykstra from Hope College. Thank you to all of them for all they do for the MHS and for this series. For attendees who are new to the Massachusetts Historical Society, we are the first historical society in the nation. We are home to 14 million manuscript pages and counting. We grow by about 150 linear feet every year. Among them are the papers of 3 generations of the Adams family, as well as the personal papers of Thomas Jefferson. But we have more than just the papers of presidents. We also have the papers of teachers and abolitionists and merchants and historians and civil rights campaigners and scientific pioneers and political leaders and people from all walks of life. We're free and open to the public. We urge you to come and visit us, see what our collections can do for you, and also to visit our current exhibit on the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, and the Siege of Boston. So check out also our website to see what's coming up in the summer months. And there you will also find that this program, the Biography series, is one of 7 programs that the research department runs over the course of the academic year. And there's something for everyone: African-American history, environmental history, history of women, gender, and sexuality, early American history, digital history. See what is there. We are putting together the lineup for the next academic year's sessions as we speak. Today's program will proceed as follows. I shall introduce our moderator today. After that, Professor Marshall will introduce our special guests, and they'll each do a presentation, and then she will engage them in a conversation. We're going to reserve about 15 minutes for Q&A with our audience members, both here in the room and also online. So that'll be about 6 p.m. We'll wrap up at 6:15 p.m. here on the East Coast. If you are in the room, please just raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone to you. And if you are online, simply type your question into the Q&A box, and Cassie will read them on your behalf. And we also have books for those of you who are here in the room to purchase. If you're interested, if you're online, we encourage you to purchase these books from your local independent bookstore. Megan Marshall is the Charles Wesley Emerson College professor at Emerson College and a past president of the Society of American Historians. Her biographies of Margaret Fuller, Elizabeth Peabody, and the Peabody sisters, Elizabeth Bishop, and the Peabody sisters have won numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize, the Francis Parkman Prize, the Mark Linton History Prize, and the Massachusetts Book Award for Nonfiction. Her book on the Peabody sisters was aided by the collections here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Professor Marshall is the recipient of the 2022 Bio Award, given annually by the Biographers International Organization to, quote, a distinguished colleague who has made major contributions to the advancement of the art and craft of biography. Her latest book is Afterlives, on biography and the mysteries of the human heart, which she presented here in this series at the MHS just a few months ago. Professor Marshall.
Thank you, Kid. And Cassie Cloutier as well, who's helping to put this program together. It's a great honor to be able to bring programs about biography 3 or 4 a year. We've been doing this for over 10 years and covered just an enormous array of subjects. And I think actually we have a biographer who's been on a panel here before. So we're a process of developing a community of biographers and biography fans in the Boston area. So this program, Breaking Silences, Using Intimate Biography to Uncover the Lives of Thomas Wen Yi Liao and Mary Mon Toy, I think you'll learn as the presenters describe their work what we might mean by intimate biography. It's a term I've kind of come up with for a life writing that really almost requires the author to step into the story. And we'll find out how that worked for each of them. So I'll give you brief introductions. Kim Liao's writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Electric Literature, LitHub, and other publications. A Taiwan Fulbright creative research scholar, Kim's work has been supported by the Vermont Studio Center, the Gentile Foundation, Ragdale, and Hambidge. She teaches writing at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And she was my student in one of my first archival research classes in the MFA Creative Writing program at Emerson College, from which she graduated in 2009. I think that the MHS could be the first archive Kim ever visited on a class field trip with a tour led by Peter Drummy back there. And and Where Every Ghost Has a Name is the culmination of work that began at that time. Marnie Mueller is the author of 3 novels, Green Fires, The Climate of the Country, and My Mother's Island, and a recipient of an American Book Award, a New York Times New and Noteworthy in paperback, a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers, and a MacDowell Fellowship. She's a longstanding member of the Women Writing Women's Lives study group based in New York City, and a member of the Duxbury Women Writers Retreat Cooperative, of which we have some other members here today. The Showgirl and the Writer is her first nonfiction book. So welcome to both of you to Boston and the MHS. And we're going to begin with Kim telling you a bit about her book. Each will speak for 10 or 12 minutes and show some images. And then we'll have.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the Massachusetts Historical Society. Thank you, Kit and Cassie. And thank you so much, Megan, for inviting us. And thanks, Marnie, for doing this with me. So excited. It's going to be a really interesting conversation, I think. So I'm just going to read a short excerpt, actually, that I have never read out loud to an audience before. The book came out in September, and I've been doing a number of book events for it. And I tend to do snappy, heart-racing drama kind of readings to try to get people to buy the book. But we're talking about intimate biography. So I wanted to read an intimate biographical section. So this takes place in the 3rd chapter. This is from Anna's perspective, who is my grandmother. So Anna is American. Thomas, her husband, is Taiwanese. This picks up during World War II in the family home in Shilaw, Taiwan, which the family referred to as Sailei in Taiwanese dialect. And the other thing you need to know is that Taiwan was a colony of Japan from 1895 to 1945. So this is a little just a tidbit from Anna's perspective, because I wanted to get us thinking about intimate biography. She resented that Thomas was free to come and go as he pleased while she was stuck in the house, that he could travel for business without a worry, while she was the one who had to face the surveillance of the Japanese soldiers. His first trips were just for a few days at a time. Then it was longer, a week. Last time he left, he'd said, "Don't wait for me. This trip will be longer." How long? She'd snapped, suddenly suspicious. Was there something or someone more attractive than the family's farming business encouraging him to linger in the northern capital? He had always been a ladies' man, and whenever they traveled before the war began, she remembered the covetous gazes of other women, envying her hold on handsome, charismatic Thomas. Anna had long resigned herself to a lifetime of gazes at her husband from other women. Before the war in the late 1930s, Thomas had been a professor of chemical engineering at Geelong University, which had offered them a life of luxury in China, with summer trips to the beautiful lakes and mountains in Guilin. The son of one of Taiwan's wealthiest landowners, Liao Chongpi, Thomas and his brothers had been educated in both Japan and China, and he and his older brother Joshua, Liao Wenkui, had both gone to America to pursue doctorate degrees. Thomas in chemical engineering, Joshua in political philosophy. It was while Thomas was finishing his PhD at Ohio State University that he met Anna, a first-year student at Ohio Wesleyan. According to Auntie Jean, he swept her off her feet and he promised her a glamorous, easy life in Asia. But when the Japanese invaded Nanjing and the war between China and Japan began, it was Anna who slipped down the dusky alleyways at dawn to buy the last train tickets to Shanghai at 5 times their usual price. Fleeing from Shanghai to Taiwan by steamship, they just barely avoided the deadly massacres by the Japanese army that Thomas later read about in the newspapers. Anna had a talent for squeezing out of dangerous situations, something she learned as an orphan in New York City. She always found a way to escape. While Anna had thus far avoided the Japanese soldiers, she feared it was just a matter of time. Last week, the maid had walked into their bedroom while she was listening to an English broadcast on their shortwave radio. And while she turned it off and hid the radio away, Anna suspected that perhaps the maid had joined the Japanese surveillance effort. She wandered out into the courtyard. The central tower loomed over her, framed by ornate balconies. Like a Taiwanese palace, this was the largest house Anna had ever lived in. But thanks to the Japanese, she was trapped in this paradise built by her husband's family fortune. The moonlight felt dewy on her face, the balmy night alive with humidity. Anna walked barefoot through the grass down to the fish pond. She ran her toes through the cool water, tracing a wavering line that sent ripples flowing outward. Then she strolled over to the Liao family mausoleum, a small gazebo housing the ashes of ancestors and beloved family members. She came here often at night when she had some private. She found the grave of Antonia, her baby daughter, who had died almost 2 years earlier. She had been a beautiful baby with dark curling hair and big eyes, smiling and cooing, brightening their lives in Silay. Antonia's sudden crib death at just 3 months old, a sudden nightmare for Anna one morning when her daughter wouldn't wake up, her breathing stymied by an unknown cause, had cast a blanket of darkness over Anna's days. But now the gray waves of monotonous sadness that filtered her days into listless black and whites had finally begun to lift, starting to shade her world in color again. While Anna couldn't sleep, at least she could walk the grounds at night away from the prying eyes of the Japanese. According to Thomas, the war was almost over. Japan had suffered great casualties during the American invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But now that she had hidden away the shortwave radio, afraid of the maid informing the Japanese about their actions, she had no way of getting more information. She would just have to wait. To those around her, Anna seemed placid, patient, stoic. But in her mind, her thoughts turned. Why didn't Thomas just come home? At least they could weather the final days of the war together. She shivered as a breeze picked up. Was this what she'd expected when they'd exchanged jokes at those international house parties in Ohio? Would he come back, make good on those promises, and lead a quiet life with her on this farming estate? She was beginning to think that maybe her husband was insatiable, seeking out the next dramatic thrill. It was difficult for him to be content living in Silay for more than a few months without leaping off on another trip. Sometimes being married to Thomas felt like having a beautiful ghost for a husband. She missed his resonant voice, his razor-sharp mind, and the way that his doting attention made her feel like the only woman in the world. She wasn't lonely per se. Her early life in New York City had hardened her into a self-sufficient pragmatist, so she relied on others for very little. But it was hard to be stuck here for so long. She craved the freedom to come and go as she pleased. As Anna returned to the house, she gazed up at the vast pinpricks of starlight dancing across the sky. She thought about her biological mother and wondered if her mother could see her right then, gazing down at her from heaven. She wished she could have asked her mother why she had given her up, why she hadn't wanted her. It was the great unanswered question of her life. That's just a little taste. The mind of Anna. Thank you. Next slide. So I'll give just a little genesis about the book, and then we'll talk more about sort of the craft of intimate biography. So I read from Anna's perspective, but the initial sort of impetus that made me do this research had to do with my grandfather Thomas, because I learned from this book, Formosa Betrayed, that he had led and ultimately failed Taiwanese independence movement, opposing Chiang Kai-shek during the martial law period in Taiwan after World War II. So after World War II, Taiwan was handed from Japan as a colony back to China. So they called it retrocession. it's the renegade province is finally coming home. No, it wasn't a renegade province back then. The Japanese had it from a treaty, and so they gave it back to China, and it was all part of sort of the treaties at the end of the war, and the U.S. had a big role in brokering this deal. However, for my grandfather and many native Taiwanese people, the Chinese government that took over was very exploitative and took advantage of the Taiwanese population. And, you think about it, this is 1945. They're battling, the communists on the mainland. There's a big civil war going. They've been battling the Japanese. They were like, oh, an island full of supplies and food. So, you look at it from different perspectives, but from Thomas's perspective, it was very exploitative, and the Taiwanese were treated as second-class citizens. So he and his brother and a group of other Taiwanese people staged this sort of ultimately failed independence movement. George Kerr was an American vice consul member who witnessed this very big riot called the 228 incident, and then the martial law arrests and kind of murderous rampage that followed of the Chinese nationalist government sort of clamping down and eradicating and arresting and torturing and killing anyone who was sort of disloyal. So this spurred this moment. However, Formosa Betrayed was the only place where this was mentioned. My aunt once mentioned to me when I was in high school, oh, our family is in a book and it's called Formosa Betrayed. And I had to get the book from the library, and my library didn't have it. So I had to get it from interlibrary loan and, read about it. And I was like, what? Like, what? So, but I couldn't find anyone else writing about it. So this was sort of the ultimate genesis of doing this sort of family history research. But I would quickly find out that there wasn't enough that had been published in English. There wasn't enough knowledge about this in the US. I had to go to Taiwan to find out what happened. So next slide. So first I talked to my family members. So this here on the right is actually a picture of Anna when she was 12 years old and came to live with a Lutheran missionary named Banta, who rescued her from being an orphan and got her started on a life and education that ultimately brought her to Thomas. So she had many, many adventures of her own. And then to our left here, or to my left here, is Margaret and Suho. So these were the family elders when I got to Taiwan. So Liao Shihao, or Suho, was my grandfather Thomas's nephew. And when my grandfather Thomas was sort of establishing this independence movement, and then ultimately sort of declaring and organizing an opposition government to oppose Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists and try to get the UN, the United Nations, or US support for this, his nephew was sort of leading the cause on the island of Taiwan. So they were really instrumental in this. And my Uncle Suho, my father's first cousin, was imprisoned for years because of it. So he and my Aunt Margaret actually had a lot to tell me about all of this. So next slide. I'm giving you like the super quick highlights so we can talk more in depth later. So the other thing that I wound up doing when I did this research was to try to also find the site of the family origin, to go back to the ancestral home. I wanted to see the ancestral home. I wanted to see the town of Shila or Sailei. I wanted to understand what it was like to live there. I wanted to sort of get to the family origins. So part of this, I think, with the sort of spirit of intimate biography, because, so much of this, I wanted to document my grandfather's life and political career and sort of why that was important. But I also wanted to find out where I came from. I think some of this stemmed from my father was the youngest. He was 2 years old when they moved to America, and he didn't know any of this. And he grew up in Brooklyn telling anyone who asked that his father was dead. So when I started looking, I was like, Dad, aren't you interested in finding this out? And he's like, this isn't important. I've made my peace with it. Like, I've moved on. So there was this sort of feelings of silences, feelings of, these big gaps in the story, feelings of, estrangement, different family members not talking about these things. So I think that I sort of thought that if I could get back to the origin, I could sort of piece together the whole family and figure out where I belong and figure out where we all belonged. So here on the my bottom right for me, stage right, is Anna as a young woman. My Auntie Jean is the girl next to her and, holding on to her. And then Thomas is the handsome fellow next to her. And Uncle Ted, Auntie Jean's younger brother, is the cute little boy sitting in his grandmother's arms. So I was eventually able to find, photographs, talk to family members. When I went to Silay, there were village people who had known the Liao family who were like, let me tell you about them. Let me tell you about the house. The house had been torn down. So, it was this sort of unraveling. One thing that was really interesting was that the family had given land and money to incorporate the Presbyterian church there. And like the church was actually sort of connected to the independence movement and to sort of opposition to the Chinese nationalists. And so the pastor had been collecting all of these things about the Liao family. And when I arrived, he's like, I've been collecting all these newspaper articles and collecting all this history about the Liao family, hoping that someone would come. And I was like, oh, you did? He's like, here, you came. So it was like this really lovely sort of, they mattered in the town. And it was really, I think people appreciated that I was there to learn. And I was so appreciative that people wanted to share these sorts of oral histories. Okay, next slide. So I did learn about my grandfather's sort of trajectory, how they incorporated into a formal independence movement and how they declared this sort of opposition government. Ultimately, he and the movement moved to Japan and sort of incorporated from there. And his provisional government of Formosa, Provisional Republic of Formosa in exile, which he was elected president of, was incorporated in 1956. And then in response to that, Chiang Kai-shek was so personally incensed, infuriated, that he sent sort of the secret police. They was like, this is a big mission to sabotage this movement and bring Liao Wenyi home. So there was a book, a sort of tell-all book written by this head garrison police officer who said, here's what we did to like the plot to sabotage this movement, to pay off his spy, to infiltrate his movement with spies, to pay off his supporters, to imprison family members, to kind of peel off his support so that we could try to get him to come home. So ultimately, he surrendered his movement in 1965. And I've talked to, Taiwanese Americans who were very, pro-independence and who put a lot of hope into him. And they were like, we were disappointed that he gave up, but now it's great to find out from your book, like why, what happened. So the other thing is that he wrote in Japanese a book called Formosanism, which is his sort of treatise of like why Taiwan deserves to be independent, why it's not the same as China, why it's its own place with its own ethnicity, culture, language. We're in the Massachusetts Historical Society. I sort of liken him to like a Thomas Paine kind of character, like he wrote stuff that future successful independence leaders and fighters looked to when they were talking about democracy, but he himself was not sort of involved in the success. But the later generations were. So next slide. I'll just give a quick preview of the later generations. So when I was in Taiwan, I was able to meet Roger Xie. He's all the way on the far side, posing in front of his prison cell. He was imprisoned with my uncle in Jingmei prison in south of Taipei for years. I think Roger was in prison for maybe 11 years and Suho for a similar number. And so he gave me a tour, like now it's a sort of a museum. But he also introduced me to other people who had fought for freedom after my grandfather. So Roger and his professor, Peng Mingmin, who became Taiwan's first democratic opposition presidential candidate in 1996. They were imprisoned in 1964 for printing a pro-independence pamphlet. They never even got to distribute it. They printed it, they had it in a hotel room, and both the purveyors of the hotel and the printer informed on them, and then they were arrested. And so it just, escalated from there. But they were part of the generation that was ultimately successful. So that was sort of a real really inspiring to meet them. And they ultimately gave me a lot of information that I needed to know to figure out sort of how my family fit into all of this. Okay, next slide. And then the other side of it that the book covers is the American side. So George Kerr was a great supporter of my grandfather and his brother Joshua, and really sort of made the case for Taiwanese independence to the American government in between 1947 and 1950. In 1950, China invaded Korea, and Truman said, no, we're not touching Taiwan. We're leaving Taiwan as it is. No one touches Taiwan. We'll just keep doing what we're doing and maintain the status quo. So they really actually considered withdrawing support from Chiang between 1947 and 1950. And then the ship sailed. But it was fascinating, speaking of archives, to dig through the foreign relations of the United States, which are all, publicly available and searchable online, to sort of see how that all played out among the State Department. So that's sort of the other side of this. Okay, next slide. I'm almost done. So this book, at the time when I first read Formosa Betrayed years and years ago, there was so little that was written about Taiwan. Now Taiwan is more talked about, and Taiwanese American authors are more self-identifying. So I sort of see this as contributing to historical narratives, to contributing to oral histories, especially during the White Terror period, the period of martial law, 4 decades of martial law in Taiwan. There was so little, captured in the National Archives about this, because the National Archives were censoring all of this. So really, it's through oral histories, it's through family stories, it's through the people who lived through it that we can capture these moments. So Green Island is a novel, but it captures that sort of 228 history. Island X is very interesting. It's got tons of interviews with students in the 70s and 80s who were sort of rallying for independence in America on college campuses, and then the spies who were paid by the KMT government to inform on them. Elegy of Sweet Potatoes is some oral history about this time period. And then Formosa Calling was written by, I want to say, an Australian who was also in Taiwan and sort of witnessed the 228 incident and all of these things. So that's it for me. That's my little preview. Next, we have Marnie.
I'm so honored to be here, and I thank Kid and Cassie for really knowing how to treat authors. It's amazing. They answer emails immediately. They put me up in a beautiful place. They were concerned, So anyway, and then of course there's Megan Marshall, who is the supreme author and generous to boot. So, and then the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. And I have a friend who's coming here to do research. And I just like to thank you for keeping this research going. We need you so badly right now. So I think I will read a tiny thing that's sort of pertinent to this from the book. It's less than a page. But it'll give you some information to go by. No academic analysis ameliorates the suffering. Only through the gradual peeling of the hundreds of thousands of individual stories coming out of the camps can we hope to heal ourselves and our nation from the consequences of our denial of this grievous history. The telling is complicated by generational differences and political pressures. The Issei were the Japanese immigrants who were still denied the possibility of United States citizenship when they were remanded to the camps. Their children, the Nisei, like Mary Mon Toy, were American-born citizens. The Kibei were Nisei who had been sent back to Japan by their parents to be schooled and acculturated in Japanese ways. Their status had no bearing on their incarceration. They were all uprooted based on race and ethnicity. But their different statehood standings tore at their hearts and self-esteem in conflicting ways that would influence the positions they took in camp, as well as having an enormous impact on their recovery after their release. The repercussions of the incarceration are far-reaching. Just as African Americans migrated from the Deep South to the North, a trip as harrowing in its own way as the earlier Middle Passage from Africa, so too Japanese Americans, after years behind barbed wire, had to travel from the camps back into America, where they were reviled, and remake lives for themselves by putting this traumatic piece of their personal and historical pasts behind them. They were like the refugees coming out of Europe, only they were refugees in their own. Everyone was affected, even those of us who were white. Okay. First slide of the alien. Yeah, okay. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, President Roosevelt instituted the Alien Enemies Act of 1789, which we now know a lot about, calling for the governmental apprehension of alien, quote, of alien enemies deemed dangerous to the public health and safety of the United States. On February 19, 1942, Executive Order 9066 flyers appeared on lampposts throughout the West Coast, throughout West Coast Japan towns, demanding that all people of Japanese ancestry, including citizens, sell their businesses and homes, readying themselves to be relocated within 24 or 48 hours to assembly centers, where they would wait to move to concentration camps being built in inhospitable rural and wilderness areas. I met Mary Mon Toy years later at a focus group for the Japanese American National Museum. We were the only two people in the room who had lived in Japanese American concentration camps during World War II. She forcibly incarcerated in Minidoka camp. Next slide. Yeah. And I was born in the Tule Lake High Security Camp in Northern California, where my Caucasian parents had gone to work to try to make an intolerable situation tolerable for the people forced to live there. Next slide. I wrote the book that brings me here today, first thinking it was to be a classic biography of Mary Mon Toy, rising above adversity to forge a successful theatrical career. But as I researched and struggled to get a handle on how to write it, and colleagues encouraged me to merge my story with hers, an intimate biography insisted itself on the text, with the necessity of breaking silences, Mary Mon Toy's, my own, and my country's, by revealing our secrets and silence about what happened, what had occurred. Now a hybrid memoir biography. It covers the friendship. Did I have another one? No, I don't. Now a hybrid memoir biography. It covers the friendship of two women, one a Japanese American performer and the other a Caucasian Jewish American writer, set against the background of one of America's greatest sins against democracy, jailing people based solely on their ethnicity and race. Over the 15 years that I knew Mary, the next slide, she had always told me that she was only half Japanese, that her father had been a Chinese doctor in Molokai, Hawaii, in Father Damien's leper colony. He had died when she was 2, and her mother had remarried an Issei man, and they had moved to Seattle. It was only after Mary's death, when I became executor of her estate, that I discovered This was a false narrative. She had been born in Seattle to Issei parents. She was totally Japanese American, or Nisei, a native-born American citizen. As I went through her personal collection of theatrical portraits, photos, scripts, and press clippings of her 5-degree career, beginning with her rapid rise from the showgirl on the chop suey circuit to white vaudeville, to glamorous lead singer at swank nightclubs, to the Latin Quarter, to legitimate Broadway theater in the groundbreaking African-American musical. The next slide. Followed by a signature role in the world of Susie Wong. I noted that she had self-described, sometimes as Chinese American, at others as half Japanese, half Chinese, and half Korean, and as ethnic Hawaiian, never as Japanese American. I wanted to know why she had masked her ethnicity. I identified with her dissembling. My family had settled in small towns as we moved east across the country after we left Tule Lake. In a new school, I was asked where I was born. I said in a prison camp for Japanese Americans. I was admonished by the teacher, saying that no such camps existed in America. And as I proceeded through high school and the university, the history of the camps was never taught. I was also introduced to American post-war anti-Semitism. Jews started the war, the children said, and held their noses as they walked past Jewish schoolmates, whispering, "It stinks of Jewish here." I learned to hide my Jewishness behind my Christian father's last name. In order to follow Mary's secret, I needed to know her real name, not an easy prospect. She had covered her tracks well. Mary's descendants, from whom she herself had cut off, only knew her birth name, Mary Teruko Watanabe. A last name, Okada, had been appended to her Social Security records. Throwing that into the mix with her birth date, I submitted a request for her files from the War Relocation Authority National Archives and Records Service, a source I had used in the past to research my family's tenure in Tule Lake. Within 2 weeks, they sent her files. Mary Teruko Okada, 1916, followed by those of her immediate family and even a husband, Shigesato Okada. The mystery had been solved. Shig for short. The Roosevelt era is our government's most documented period of American history. The tragic incarceration of people of Japanese ancestry is a boon to researchers. The files on the camps yield shockingly intimate and detailed private material on the incarcerated. I learned that Mary had wed Shig a mere 2 months before Pearl Harbor. I learned that she developed enormous dermoid ovarian tumors and suffered the removal of her ovaries in the camp hospital. I discovered letters written by her in which her intelligence, diligence, and ability to negotiate at the age of 26, the most trying of tasks, the release from the camp for herself, her husband, her brother, and her parents. I learned that her marriage to Shig did not survive the tribulations of their almost 2 weeks in camp.
Almost 2 years.
2 years in camp, I'm sorry. While researching my parents' time in Tule Lake, I also relied on the Japanese American Evacuation and Resettlement Study, a project conceived by University of California, Berkeley sociologist Dorothy Swain Thomas, employing brilliant Japanese American sociologists and historians during their imprisonment to keep secret day-to-day diaries about the life and work of the camp. In an interview with my father about meeting the trains and settling prisoners into their new tar paper covered, crudely constructed, quote, homes, he said, I learned quickly not to enter with the family, but to stand outside. It was too terrible to witness the pain in people's faces, especially the Issei women, too shameful for them to be seen in that degrading situation. As I read about the Watanabe's experience, I was inside that room, living Mary's sense of degradation. This book became difficult for me to write as I witnessed in the most granular detail how Mary and her family had suffered. My friend was a proud, gutsy old lady. I was now seeing her as a brave young 26-year-old whose life had come apart. Okay, the next photograph. Mary Teruko Watanabe Okada arrived alone in New York City in the fall of 1943, where she attended the Juilliard School on scholarship as a working student. In 1946, at the age of 30, after being told by her music instructor that she could never get a role in opera, not even as Madama Butterfly, because she was Asian, she scoured the trades. She answered a call for Oriental girls 5, 6, and over, and landed her first job as a showgirl in the slant-eyed scandals at the China Doll Club on Times Square. Teruko Watanabe Okada gave way to Mary Mon, a China doll, and later to Mary Mon Toy. What I didn't have was documentation of her private life once out of the camp, except for torrid letters from her many lovers in which I could discern the silence in the pattern of her affairs, the abrupt ending of relationships when any man got too close or wanted to marry her. I deduced that she feared he would find out that she was Japanese American, that she had been incarcerated, that she had been married, that she could not bear children. Of the people I interviewed, only Emiko Tokunaga, a Japanese American choreographer and dancer, knew definitively that she was Japanese American and had been in a camp. Emiko helped to corroborate one particular event that had a lasting effect on Mary. Okay, then we better just do the next slide so we're ready. In her files dated April 21, 1944, Mary was called before a war relocation panel in Manhattan to determine if she would be sent back to camp. Shig had been an FBI, had an FBI file that described him as an agitator in camp. Mary was presumed suspect by association with him. Emiko led me to another simultaneous incident whereby Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, usually pro-immigrant, vociferously complained for all to hear that the government was, in his words, dumping dangerous Japanese Americans from the camps onto New York City, and he wanted them sent back to the West Coast. And that's the page, right? Okay. Though Mary was eventually cleared and awarded permanent leave clearance, Emiko said that after that, Mary was afraid to reveal herself, afraid that she would be sent back to camp or even expatriated to Japan, a place she'd only visited on one trip as a teenager to meet her mother's family. It had happened once, it could happen again, as we well know now. It's said that we become the lie. I hid that I was Jewish into adulthood. I know the terror of being found out. I know how hard it is to give up the secret, but I also know the enormous relief of finally revealing oneself. Mary was never able to let go of her cover. Next slide. Though she walked on picket lines in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, protesting racist yellow casting and advocating for affirmative action in the theatrical world. She identified herself as a Chinese American actor to the very end. She would always insist to me that she had to write her own obituary, that no one else could get it right. Next slide. It was left to me and her descendants to do it for her. Close. Okay.
Well, thank you, both of you. Such moving presentations. It's hard to do anything other than have a moment of silence for these lives. While I think about what I might ask. I have some questions, though.
You do have questions.
Anyway, thank you so much, both of you. So, Marnie, you spoke a little bit about realizing you were going to have to enter into this story yourself. It would not just be a biography of Mary. And Kim, although we didn't get that sense from the part you read, you also are very much in the story. We see you arriving in Taiwan, and you've learned the wrong kind of Chinese, and you're flummoxed, and I'm just wondering if you could each talk a little bit more about that decision to write in the first person a biography or a book about other people, and what you gained and what were some of the challenges in that.
Do you want to go
Marnie,
first? Because
I was going to say, Marnie, do you want to start? Because you attempted the classic biography and then
right.
inserted yourself, whereas I always had myself.
I was invited into this biography group. I have no idea why, because I really wasn't basically writing a biography at that point. But I had a notion of what would be a grown-up way to be a biographer. And I wrote many, 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 many pages of stiff, boring work about history, about this and about that. And somebody read it and said, you're not writing a dissertation about this experience. And other people said, you really have to you've had an extraordinary experience of growing up with this knowledge of having been born in that camp. You should put yourself in. And it was terrible. I didn't think I had a right to do it. I didn't think I had a right to tell the story of other people who had definitely suffered more than we had, until I finally realized that it would add something to the story and that I had to do it. I had to do it for my own self too, I did it. And then, of course, it really had to be in first person. Everything had to be in first person. So I did it, and I'm glad I did it, because I learned a lot from the experience. I learned a lot about what my gaps were in terms of race. I had grown up in a family that was totally a liberal family. We had Black friends come to our house and everything who talk openly about the experience. I had even been asked as a 17-year-old to teach a class of one of these people about what it means to be the only Black person in the classroom. But I didn't really know. I didn't know the depths of the anger and that people were feeling. I had missed stuff. I realized that empathy and sympathy is not enough when you're working cross-culturally and cross-racially. You have to cop to your own deficiencies and then face up to those, and then you can begin to see the person in a different light. So,
thank you. Kim, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I'm thinking about what Marnie said too, like the sort of the unresolved feelings, that like putting your own unresolved feelings in it gave you sort of the frame to talk about your friendship with Mary. For me, I had started with myself with sort of the being biracial and not knowing about my father's family and digging for, not knowing where where my father's family came from and then what my grandfather had done in Taiwan. So there was sort of the search to know my family. But I was going to say, when I was working on my thesis with Megan as my thesis advisor, there was a lot of that. There was a lot of churn. There was a lot of like Kim in her mid-20s being like, I don't know what's wrong. And she was like, yeah, maybe take some of that out. But that's important. And I feel like I teach memoir classes now. And there's this sort of, you have to have this balancing act, right? Between the stakes that the reader has for the character of the first person character and versus just venting, or versus sort of the author or the narrator having the distance to see around their own perspective. So there was a period where I was like, nope, I'm just going to be the way in. I'm just going to be like a journalist. This is a draft that you didn't read. This was the book took me almost 15 years to write. So this is maybe like year 8. I'm like, no, Kim's barely in it. She's a journalist. She's like, here's what happened, and takes a much more like, distance vantage point, but it did affect the tone. And I think that there was this sort of issue of how close can I get to the characters and inject them with real humanity. And then like, I need to then sort of position myself in my relationship to them to say, hey, I'm going on this speculative limb to write them, imagining what they said and did and thought, knowing only what they said and did, or knowing only what they did reported by others. And so I think that then at some point the personal had to come back into it. But I was very judicious when I brought Kim, the character, back in, because for a while she was sort of pushed aside.
So turning the question around in a way, many biographers come to their subjects after years of researching that field, or, if you're writing about Gertrude Stein, you've written critical essays about Gertrude Stein your whole life, and now you can write the biography. Neither of you were experts in these fields when you entered in. How did you, challenge yourself to do enough research to be authoritative, and how do you fold it in without, letting it sog?
Well, that's the fun part. Anybody who's been a biographer, nosy, you read, the archives, but you also dig into different things. Like you read obituaries, you pick up information from that, who was married to whom, when they died, The problem for me was that everything had to be documented. There was tons of material on my parents in the National Archives, in the literature. I had to be careful that I couldn't just tell a family story. I had to be careful that it was actually documented and that it worked in that way. And that was a problem. And then there was massive, I didn't really get into much to Mary's career. There was massive material on her career. So I had to really study racism in the performing arts. I had to do with the House of Flowers, which was a really groundbreaking, with Pearl Bailey and Alvin Ailey and all these really unbelievable people who changed the color of Broadway and dance in America. So I had to make sure that was right. Even my husband, who told stories about growing up during the war, and as a German, not as a Jew, I had to even go in to make sure his stories, when he talked about when he was bombed there and had to run to the bunker, I had to find documentation that the bombs did fall when my husband was pillow talk telling me these stories. So in the end, I had a massive amount of information. And then I've done that in another talk. I then figured, how am I going to organize this material? And then I realized that I'm a novelist and that there are ways that novelists keep the story going. I love to keep the story going, the narrative going. So I didn't ever make anything up. I never fictionalized anything, but I used techniques, fictional techniques, one of which I will just say right now. And then, if somebody wants to know more afterward, we can do it. there was a moment where I discover halfway through the book that she has lied to me. And that in fiction is called a reversal. And that means the reversal means you're going along on one train of thought, and suddenly something happens and you have to change the train of thought. And then I decided I had been suspicious of her. I had thought maybe she was lying to me about certain things. So I went back and heightened those a little bit. My suspicions made them apparent. And that was just one example of how I did it. So there was a tension in the book that I could use to keep people. And then people told me when they read the book, get rid of some of that historical material. So I put it in the footnotes. And it was great to have it in the footnotes. It told a whole other story. There are pictures that run through that tell one story. There's the narrative that runs through that tells another story. And there are the footnotes that tell another story. And I noticed that Kim really used that. I loved reading her footnotes.
Biographers reading each other's footnotes. Yes. Well, when you said that, the winnowing down, that happened for me in my writing group. I brought them some of the more historically oriented sections where, say, Thomas is building the movement with his brother and their sort of followers. And, and then there's State Department letters and telegrams and I had everything sort of footnoted there just to keep track of. But my writing group was like, do you want this to be academic or do you want this to be a non-fictional novel? They're like, you have to pick a track. And I was like, I want it to read like a non-fictional novel. I want it to read, like, as Marnie said, follow the story, follow the narrative, see where this is going, so then the structure had to sort of support that. And I was like, I can move this to the note section. Megan's note section of the Peabody sisters was my model of this because she writes in this beautiful, illustrative, lively tone. And then you go to the back and you're like, oh, this came from this letter, and this came from that letter, and this came from wherever. So you can see the whole skeleton in the back of the notes. And I remember being like, my mentor has a 50-page note section at the end of her book. And, it's possible to sort of have the narrative and then have the underpinnings for everything.
Well, I asked them each to come with a question for the other. So why don't you do that? And then we'll have questions from the audience.
I love what did I call them? Narrative interludes.
Oh, yes. Yes.
It works wonderfully.
And you'd say when her reading was a kind of narrative.
Yeah. So it's hard for people to enter a book of a completely different culture with names that you can't necessarily remember because they don't relate to your names, So what she did was she would every once in a while, at a point, she would open up the story with a story about these people right at the time that they were going through something, historical and political. And then I would check back to the notes and they were based on something. They were based on a letter, they were based on an interview, they were based on whatever. So I knew that she never made something up, but she did something with this that made you really fall in love with these characters. You may not fall in love with everything that they did, but you fell in love with them as friends. You knew what their struggles were. And I thought it was really good. I know a lot of people who tried this, quote, fictionalization of biography or whatever, and I've never seen it really work. People struggle with it and it doesn't work. This is, how did you do it?
I'm like, what's the question? So I mean, eventually, I think the book was always going to have those two threads, the thread of Kim, the character, doing the search, and then the thread of animating the history from conversations, from letters, from, George Kerr. I didn't read this part, but I was thinking about reading this part. George Kerr writes in Foremost of Betrayed that Thomas was arrested in Japan in maybe early 1951 and sent to prison and threatened with extradition back to Taiwan, which would mean certain death. And then he gets put under house arrest. And so then there are a couple scenes of him getting arrested, George Kerr calls Anna and tells her, Anna freaks out, like here's what happens until they settle on house arrest. So, right. So I didn't fabricate anything. Everything happened, but it was that sort of trying to go in and be like, well, how did it happen? Or why did it happen? Or why did the person do the thing they did? And so that was always going to be part of the book. And I think, biographers who have subjects like, Margaret Fuller, for example, who have written lots of letters, have like a voluminous documentation they can go to. And when you're trying to do that with someone who has less about them, it's like, how do you triangulate and do enough intersecting research that you can say, okay, I know sort of this person, Anna didn't really talk about how she was feeling to her family. But what might she have imagined to herself? What had just been going on in her life? And, what did she like to do before the war? She was very free and she would go swimming in the fish pond and she had these fun relationships with the neighbors. And then during the war, she was very buttoned up because the Japanese were at war with America and thought she was a spy. And then after the war, so it's sort of triangulating what might this character have felt. So, I mean, there is a certain amount of fictional techniques applied, but I tried to have as much of it be informed by details. She told a story about hiding the shortwave radio in the chicken coop and like not telling people what was happening. So, these like tiny details that you try to then smash into a single scene.
I want to add one thing, that if you study the book, if you want to study her book for why it works, you also, it works because of the narrative voice, the inquiring narrative voice of Kim. So when she's stumbling around and starting to do it, you sort of go back to that, when you're finding about other people. So it isn't the same voice, but it's a comparable voice that works.
Well, thank you, Marnie. Marnie's my best publicist right now. Thank you so much. So I had wanted to ask you initially about sort of, again, like that choosing of how much historical context to include, but we already talked about that. Another theme that I really connected to was this sense of marginalization, this idea that you'd been born in the camps and you felt like you had to hide it. And, the Jewish identity that you felt like you had to hide. And so these sort of layers of feeling marginalized and then also hiding it. And I wondered, I don't know if this affected your structure at all. I was so curious also about the structure of sort of telling your story and then telling Mary's story and then telling the intersections. Do you want to speak more about either of those things?
Well, I was marginalized in many ways. The
Yeah.
McCarthy period came up. There were lots of things I was hiding, and we always lived in working class neighborhoods, and my parents were highly educated, but my father was an organizer and my mother was a teacher. So I had to be careful. I had to, and I also, went out with bad boys. That was the way I found a way to fit in. And it's very hard to get out of that sense of marginalization, even to this day. In terms of, but I could, what I did find when I discovered that we were two different people, Mary and I were two different people, I was filled with insecurities. Mary was not, because she was brought up by her mother to love her race, and her mother had prepared her for racism in America. My parents had not done that for me. I was on my own. So it was, then I could look at her differently. Then I could understand where her anger came from. It came from a different place than mine. Mine was marginalization. She was betrayed by her government right at the time when she was ready to blossom, and she was mad as hell about it, But it took me a long time to pick that up,
Oh, that's super interesting. We have questions from the audience now. Yes. Oh, we're going to get a mic for you.
Thank you to all of you for, a really excellent set of readings and for a wonderful discussion so far. My question actually builds very directly off of the question that Kim just asked. And it's that in both of your stories, it sounds like there's I guess I'm wondering in both of your stories about the role played by being either mixed race or mixed ethnicity, and the ways in which both for yourselves as biographers, as people investigating these stories and coming to them with mixed identities, but also to some extent for your historical actors and for the families that you're talking about, as you know, families that are adopted, families that well, the fact that Mary claims to be half Chinese for so long. So I guess I wonder for both of you about what the salience of like mixed racial or ethnic persons to your stories is, and like how that dimension of identity figures into it. Thank you.
Great question.
Oh yeah, that is a good question. Well, I think in my story, there's a lot of like boundary crossing, like national boundaries, you know, like fitting in, learning languages, understanding, finding like the story underneath that's been hidden. And then sort of the taboos of silence and breaking the silences. And so that definitely played in for me a lot. I mean, and I really related to this Marnie feeling like she didn't fit in, and that somehow giving her even more sort of currency to write the Japanese incarceration story, to having witnessed it in this really personal way. For me, in America, everyone was like, "Ooh, what are you? You're so exotic." And then when I got to Taiwan, everyone was like, "Ooh, you're white." And I was like, "Wait, hold on. I'm not like I never belong anywhere." So that definitely, there was a lot of sort of being the other and being the one from a distance. But I will say maybe the good side of this is speaking with Taiwanese Americans whose families were, you know, really like decimated or, you know, like afraid during the White Terror period, or who had family killed, you know, after the 228 incident. They were like, you have distance, so you could see in a way that we couldn't, or we were always afraid to. So there was something interesting about that. And that was given to me by others. Insight.
Yeah, I saw myself as a person to walk white people into this experience. That was the role I felt I had, not to convince Japanese Americans that they went through a bad thing, you know, but was to walk them in. And it's so interesting that often I get the question, weren't you mad at Mary that she had lied to you? And first I was like, what are you talking about? But then I understood that people didn't understand really why she had lied. And she's not to blame, nor am I to blame. It was the government that's to blame for people passing. It's the society that's to blame for the people passing. It's anti-Semitism. I hate to even use the term right now, since it's been weaponized by our president, but it's the society that did these things that made you hide. And it's said that every biographer writes a biography to find something in themselves. And what I found in one of the things I found in myself is don't be so hard on yourself. The fact that you passed, it's no crime to have done it. You did it for a reason. You had to do it to survive. So I feel the same way about Mary. The thing that makes me sad about Mary is that she had completely cut off from the Japanese American community, except for Emiko and that when I did a thing for densho.org, if anybody doesn't know about that, you should go. It's the preeminent website for the Japanese American incarceration. It's a fabulous research source, and it's growing. And there's a wonderful researcher who heads it, who actually vetted my book. He helped me, figure out that the history changed over the time that I was writing the book. So, but I don't know why I got on that tangent. I don't know where that was leading me, but it was really, I know, because of Mary. When I did a little bio for her, you can go online and you can see it. They were shocked. People were shocked. They didn't know. One guy had an inkling. I found one journalist who had written something when she was in the World of Susie Wong. He said, we've heard that she's blah, 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 you know, but nobody knew. And she would have been much more famous if she had had her community behind her. That's the sadness. That's the real sadness.
I think we have a question online. We do not have a question online. Okay, back to the room.
Thank you so much. How did you both decide what not to include?
I have like 5-10 books worth of things that didn't go into the book. So I'm not even sure how to answer that question. It was like write this giant thing, put it away, and then write a much smaller, more focused sort of only the Taiwanese history that my family touched, and then that, you know, that Roger and Peng sort of touched to sort of give an inkling of what happened next. And then I don't know, it was just like, is this necessary? No. And then it got throw it away.
Yeah.
It's a relief to
Yeah.
do that too.
Yeah, it is. No, I had such a huge amount, but I had a rule. If it doesn't make I'm a novelist, so if it didn't make the narrative move, I wouldn't. If it bogged down the narrative, well, I could stick it in, you know, footnotes. But the other thing was, I picked up some really dirty cross ethnic betrayals, and I decided I'm not going there. Somebody else can do that. I mean, I talked to one dancer who Mary had taken her name. She was a famous tap dancer. And I had heard a story that she had been betrayed, and she passed as Chinese American so that she wouldn't go into the camps. She hid out. That was very dangerous. And a Chinese American performer outed her, so that she and her partner had to skip town and go hide in, you know, in the countryside or whatever, to not be, you know, go to jail for this. And I interviewed her, and I told her that Mary had used her name to, you know, this, and that Mary was also Japanese American. And she said, oh, we never talked about such things then. And she was really upset that she didn't know that. But she told me that I could use this story, and I decided I'm not going there. I mean, there were stories like that all the way through. They would have been big stories, but I decided I don't want to go there. So.
Hello. $1 million question. How did you organize your research?
How did you organize your research is the question.
You want to take this one? I didn't organize it at all. And I got into real trouble when I had to do the footnotes. It was like, I remember that, but where is it in my files? And at one point, I wrote to this Brian Nija, who's the historian there. I said, Brian, I know I found this someplace, but I don't know where I found it. It was about the toilets. And it was the only place I found this thing about the toilets. So it was really important. And I quoted it to him, and he said, I heard that. But, you know, there's one thing that you said, and I can't remember what the word was. He said that sort of is triggering something in me. I took that one word, I put it in with toilets, and up popped the source. I mean, it was like, thank you, Brian, you know. And then I told him, I think he was mad that he hadn't known about that source, because it was a really good source. And it really told a story that was not told anyplace else. You know, they came in to these camps, and there were just holes. There were no partitions. There was nothing. But the important thing, this is what he picked up on. There was a trough underneath where all the poop and everything went in. And if it wasn't flushed out regularly, which it wasn't, it was terrible. So I just put that up, not poop, but I did,
Draw.
something.
Draw.
something.
Yeah, I would say my research was my research organization was a cautionary tale. Next nonfiction book will be much
Yes.
better.
Okay.
One very quick last question.
I'm intrigued by what you said, Marnie, about walking white people into the experience. And you did that so wonderfully. But I remember thinking as I was reading that Mary didn't particularly want to talk about the experience of the
No,
camps.
she didn't.
That she was,
That's a
moving
very
forward.
important moment.
And so you had to really flesh out a lot. And how did you do that without feeling, without making it up, I guess is my question.
No, because I found sources.
Right. Like
that
the one you just
corroborated.
mentioned. Yeah.
But the moment it was early on in our relationship, and it was December 7th. And I said proudly to Mary, do you know what day this is? I mean, we, thinking we had this in common. And she turned on me that we were going to a theater. She's turned on me, yes, I remember what day it is, but I would rather not be reminded. Of course, she died on December 7th.
Well, I was going to ask a question about the contemporary relevance of these narratives, and whether you might want to say something about that. Do you take some courage from the stories you've learned, or have advice or wisdom?
I mean, I think it's worth looking at how did authoritarian governments consolidate power in the past. I had a friend who was reading maybe the middle of my book right now, and actually it's when Thomas gets arrested in Japan, and Anna says in America you would say you can't hold him in jail because you simply don't have a right to. And my friend texted me that line and she's like, this is chilling. Did you know how relevant this is now? And I was like, I wrote that years ago. Like, I thought I was very naive about American democracy when I first started this. I did not think, this was like pre 2012 midterm elections, like I was very naive about how polarized we could get. So I think it's worth reading about. How do authoritarian powers consolidate power?
It's a very scary thing to come up against this. It really is. And all I can say is, I mean, people of my age, I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it for the children, demonstrating all the time. And doing whatever I'm doing. Everybody, if they can find a thing to do, should do it. I think that's working. I mean, all across the country, everyone is finding their own way to come up against it. Stop blaming the Democrats. What you have to do is consolidate power so that the Democrats have the power to do things. And it's, but it's scary. I remember going and demonstrating against the Iraq war, and everybody was pro-Iraq war. And I went down to Washington to demonstrate, and the first thing I saw were American flags. And I thought, oh my God, am I brave enough to do this? And then I discovered that it was our side that was carrying the American flags. But it was that moment of thinking, am I brave enough to come up against this? So I think everybody just does whatever little thing they can do. I have a little, what's called a thread of about 20 people, and we post on the thread. And I thought, well, do people think this is really stupid to do this? What good is this? We post, demonstrations, we post our opinions, we post that. And I have gotten so many comments from people saying, this is sustaining me to know that there are other people there. And the last thing I'll say is the best rally I went to was for the lawyers. It was down at Foley Square. And I'm not a lawyer, but I went down to support them. And it was basically a pep rally for them. They said, we have to be brave. We have to stand together. We have to stand with the ACLU, even if we're in And it was wonderful. It was absolutely, powerful and wonderful. So.
It's true. As long as we have the courts, as long as we have free journalism, as long as we can record these stories, we're not entirely in the darkness.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. And don't forget to buy some of those books that are back there. They really are. Even a kid read the books and was deeply, not even, and he was saying, this is, yes, they're very moving, as you can tell from the presentations.